All right, today we're going to turn this into this. Stick around to find out how. Alright, making a European mount is relatively inexpensive. We only need 7 things. Start it off, flesh and knife. Just got to get the leftover flesh and hair off of our skull. Something to poke out the brain. Screwdriver does the trick. You're going to need a turkey fryer. Fill it up with water. We're just going to boil the meat off the skull. Pair of gloves. This is basically just 20 volume hydrogen peroxide. You just go to a local beauty store and they'll have this. Saran wrap. We're going to use this to wrap around the antlers so they don't get discolored with the peroxide, and tape just to make sure that saran wrap's secure. That's all you need. So our first step is going to be to start skinning this skull out. So we'll do that and have this guy polished up and wait in no time. Alright, so as we're skinning out our skull, we want to make sure we don't have too much downward pressure on the skull itself. We don't want to put any extra nicks or cuts into the bone. We want the blade of our knife to be flush against the skull but cutting away from the skull itself. Remember, our cuts don't have to be clean, they don't have to look pretty, they just have to get this meat and flesh off this skull. Ugh, that is something you see in a nightmare. Now that we have the majority of the flesh off of our skull, we can take it over and dip it into the boiler for the first round. Alright, now that our water's boiling, we're going to take our skull, we're just going to set it in the boiling water. The hot water will boil the meat off for us, it'll boil the flesh, make it a lot easier to take our knife and finish off getting the bottom jaw off and getting the rest of all that gunk off. So we'll let that sit in there for probably 5 minutes the first round, let it get nice and warm, let the meat and whatnot start to fall off. Pull it out and we'll get back on it, start knocking the rest of it off. Alright, it's been about 5 minutes. So we're going to pull this out, we're going to take them in, start knocking this meat off and this flesh off and this bottom jaw. You can see the meat just literally just cooks right on the skull here. So we're going to take them, knock the rest of this off, and stick them back in once we get some more of that off. Alright, so this second round we really want to focus on the membrane on top of the skull as well as the bottom jaw and the roof of the mouth. The bottom jaw is going to come out and we're going to throw it away. We don't use that for a European mount, it just gets in the way. So the roof of the mouth needs to come out as well, and we're just going to continue to work as much meat off the skull as possible until the skull starts to cool down. At that point the meat will start to harden up and we'll just have to pop it back into the turkey fryer for a second boiling to get the meat loosened back up for us, and then we'll start skinning it again. Alright, so now we're going to use our brain poker and start loosening up this brain. The boiling water really melts the brain down for you. We're just going to use the poker to try to loosen up the sac that the brain's in. We're going to get these little nodules off the back of the skull here, these little bones. They're just very superficial bones. Your knife will carve right through them, so no big deal there. And then once we get some more of that meat off the back of the skull here, we're going to plop it right back into the boiler, let it heat some more of it up, and we'll start skinning again. Alright, looks like we got quite a bit more off here. We're going to take it and knock the rest of this meat off here in the rear of the skull, get the rest of the gunk out of the brain cavity, start pulling these sinuses out, and go from there. Alright, so we've now made it to the nasal cavity, which is, in my opinion, the worst part about making a European mount. But if you have yourself a pair of needle nose pliers, it really helps you get into the little crevices and in between the little bones inside the nasal cavity to help you pull out these big chunks as well as the small little pieces of cartilage. But it all has to come out so your deer doesn't stink while it's hanging on your wall, because if you don't get it all out, it will rot and it will stink. Alright, let's go pop this back into the turkey fryer now that we got most of the sinus out. It's coming along. Alright, so one more item you will need that I forgot to tell you earlier is Dawn dish soap. The only reason we're putting this in here is to clean the skull up a little bit and to degrease the skull so the peroxide sticks to it and whitens it up. Alright, so after we pull it out of our Dawn dish soap and water mixture, we're just going to take our pliers and get off any last little pieces of meat off the back of our skull and check our nasal cavity, make sure it's cleaned, and then it's time for the saran wrap. Now the saran wrap is probably the most important part of this European mount to make sure that our antlers don't get dyed white as well. We want them to keep their natural color. So we're going to wrap the antlers in saran wrap real tight, and then we're just going to take our tape, any sort of tape, we're going to wrap it over top of the saran wrap to ensure that no water and no peroxide gets in underneath these antlers. Again, we want them keeping their natural bone color. We don't want those dyed as well. So we're going to wrap these up as tight as we can, and then it'll be time for the peroxide. Alright, so our last step now is just to take our skull, put the peroxide in with the water, and bleach the skull, turn it white. So the water is about to the base of the antlers. We're just going to take our peroxide, slowly dump enough to just cover the skull. We're going to dump about half of this in here. And then we're going to top it off with water. Make sure that the back of the skull is completely covered with our mixture. So that's in there. Now we'll just let it sit. We'll let it in here for roughly 2 to 5 minutes, and then we'll keep pulling it out as we go and check it just to make sure once it's white, it's done. Alright, after 2 to 3 iterations of dunking it in our solution, it looks like our skull is the color that we're looking for. So let's take this inside, unwrap it, and see what we've got. And there we are. There's our finished product. Looks pretty good. Alright folks, if you like this video or you feel like you learned something, please do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. Also click the little bell to turn on notifications, that way you're the first to see when all our videos are published. As always, thank you, and we hope to see you again.